The UAE economy is the second largest economy in the GCC, one of the most international economy in the whole MENA region. And therefore, it was affected by the double whammy of the coronavirus shock and the drop in oil price. I think the positive element comes from the fact that authorities reacted very quickly and swiftly in addressing the spreading of the coronavirus and have introduced pioneer measures in terms of controlling the spreading, increasing the number of testing, and introducing technology as a way and mean to address and to contain the spreading of the virus. This has helped UAE to gradually open up their economy. Of course, this shock will have an impact on the oil sector that is important in UAE, as well as also on the non-oil sector. And we expect, like other GCC countries, that growth projections this year will be lower than the one we published last April. But I would say here two additional elements. One, UAE was able to regain access to market, and we saw that with Abu Dhabi reaching a successful Eurobond transaction a few weeks ago. And also we saw a reorganization of the response level, with the government learning from the first lessons in order to provide a more efficient and effective way of addressing the COVID-19 shocks. Of course, there are some risks to certain sectors that are exposed internationally, like tourism, like airline and transportation. Those would require special attention. Going forward, it's important for UAE economy to keep the investment that has been put in saving lives, expand the utilization of technology in addressing the virus, but also in providing new opportunities. And this is one of the silver linings that we see with this crisis, to increase access to finance, to increase access to support to SMEs. The central bank has introduced an important package in this direction. It's important to keep in this direction while also making sure that the stability of the financial system is protected. It is also important to keep the transformation of the government-related entities to make them more competitive. And also, last but not the least, it's important to think about the new diversification strategy that will allow UAE to maintain its leading role in growing the non-oil sector, especially in the last decade. We saw a fast growing of various activities outside the oil industry.
Thank you. And their questions on the GCC are also, what are the projections for the GCC region, the risks and recommendations for oil exporters in the region, and whether you have an estimate for the fiscal balance and need to refinance for GCC in dollars?
Well, of course, this shock had an impact on most of the GCC countries, although GCC countries have different level of buffers and access to liquidity, and therefore the way they have dealt with the crisis and the way this crisis affected their economy is different. We expect growth to be negative this year by 7.3%. And it's both in the oil sectors as well as also in the non-oil sector. In terms of impact on budget deficit and external account, yes, those two sectors are the most affected. We expect deficit to reach levels of 8 to 10% on average this year. But the good news is the non-oil fiscal balance is showing more resiliency than the overall balance. Of course, those countries were affected by the return in capital flows that we saw in the beginning of the crisis, but they regained access to international capital markets, and they were able to finance at relatively acceptable rates with ample demand their financing need for this year.
Thank you. We will move to Lebanon. We have many. We have questions from Sabine Ouais and Nahar, from Ruba Al-Husseini, AFP, Sarmant Khan, The National, Abir Abu Omar from Bloomberg. So we will start with the first question. Is there a suspension of the discussions with the authorities, and what is the IMF's position?
Well, as you know, discussions with the authorities continues. They have started after the request by the Lebanese authorities based on the program that was approved by the cabinet to have funds assistance. The IMF team started the discussions with the authorities, and the discussions are ongoing. The last session took place last week on Friday, and the purpose of this session was to look into the details of the reform plan for the electricity and the energy sector, which constitute an important part of the government plan. Of course, Lebanon is enduring one of the most severe crises with a strong contraction in the economy, as well as also high level of inflation. This crisis has been compounded by the COVID-19 shock that also affected lives and livelihoods, and Lebanon was also one of the countries who succeeded to rein in and control the pandemic. The IMF team is currently discussing with the authorities the various components of the plan on the issues related to the financial sector and the determination of the level of loss, on the fiscal reforms, as well as also on the structural reforms, and last but not the least also on the social protection part of the plan.
Thank you. Thanos Arvanitis, Deputy Director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department, will now take the rest of the questions on Lebanon. One of the questions is what is the status of the talks? Is there a breakthrough, and what are the key challenges? What are the risks? Apparently, talks with the IMF have stalled, and there is no significant progress in terms of an agreement on a rescue package to save the Lebanese economy. Is that correct? What does the IMF rescue package hinge on? And what are the chances of Lebanon surviving without an IMF bail?
Thank you, Wafa. These are several questions, so I'll try to break them down. I think Jihad has provided already an answer on what is the status of the talks with the Lebanese authorities. So let me start by answering the question on what are the key challenges in the discussions. Lebanon faces several interrelated challenges, as underlying problems have been allowed to persist for many years. Public debt is unsustainable, the fiscal framework and the tax administration are weak, and the banking model is unviable. The state-owned enterprises are loss-making and provide inadequate services to the population, and the economic base generally is too narrow and uncompetitive. These are very complex issues that require a common assessment of the size of the problems and a strategy to address them in an effective manner. As we have stated in the past, we believe that the government's original plan went in the right direction. It provided an assessment of the challenges and an estimate of the financial losses that were broadly in the right order of magnitude, and proposed a comprehensive plan to address them, including in terms of public debt sustainability and also financial sector restructuring. At this point, for productive discussions to continue, it is very important that the authorities unite around the government's plan. From our side, we are ready to work together with the authorities to improve the plan where this is necessary. However, we are also worried that attempts to present lower losses and postpone difficult measures into the future would only increase the cost of the crisis by delaying the recovery and also hurting particularly the most vulnerable. Let me now take the second question, that was, what is the IMF's position, what the IMF solution is for Lebanon? We believe that an economic reform program needs to stop the immediate deterioration of economic conditions, support the most vulnerable from the impact of the crisis, and lay the conditions for sustainable growth. In this regard, the program, in our view, needs to offer a comprehensive strategy to restructure public debt, strengthen the fiscal framework, recapitalize the banks, reform key parts of the economy, particularly state-owned enterprises, and improve, importantly, governance and transparency. Given the impact of the crisis on Lebanese people, it's also important, as Jihad said, to expand the social safety net to protect the most vulnerable. Beyond agreeing on this strategy, I think it's essential also the authorities to begin implementing critical economic reforms to immediately stop the worsening of economic conditions. This includes, in particular, passing the capital controls law and also begin to take steps to restore fiscal and debt sustainability, including with the 2020 budget. Now, there was also a question about, can Lebanon do without an IMF program? At this moment, our efforts are focused on helping the authorities formulate the reform plan to appropriately address the current challenges and restore sustainable growth. We hope that the discussions continue in this direction, and we're available to the authorities to continue to provide technical advice as they see needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thanos. We have a question from Simeon Kerr from the Financial Times. Given the IMF sees worsening poverty across the region, potentially rekindling social unrest, which countries are you most concerned about? What should governments do to limit that risk?
Well, Simeon, it's of course one of the key challenges that the region was facing prior to the COVID-19 shock. And one of the takeaways of this crisis is we saw that certain number of vulnerabilities were exacerbated. I will cite few of them. One is the informality in the economy that was providing some resiliency in the past, proved to be one of the weak points, especially it did not allow in certain cases the opportunity for the governments who have introduced several measures to reach out to those groups. And in certain cases, countries had to invent new techniques, like for example in Morocco, or in Tunisia or in Jordan, by finding ways to use electronic means in order to reach out to this group. A second vulnerable group are the youth and women. We have been at the fund focusing on those priorities for the last years, considering that given the high level of unemployment at the youth level and limited participation of women in the economy, there is great potential here that is untapped. And by increasing this level of participation, we can grow the economy. And several studies that we did and others did showed the importance of that. And this is still an important element in the recovery to make sure that we account for those who are, on one hand, vulnerable, but also on the other hand, they could constitute the opportunity for the region in the future. A third category of vulnerabilities are the internally displaced, the refugees, who are facing a hardship of their life, but also the very weak quality of infrastructure. I'll give you an example. In a country like Yemen, we have 0.7 bed per 1,000 person, while the average should be 2.7%. Therefore, the quality of the infrastructure, especially when you have this level of vulnerability, is high. Those are important elements, and this is why we believe it's very important that this recovery takes into account a new social protection model, a social protection model that expands the coverage, builds a certain number of social safety nets, but also use certain new instruments like training, capacity building, in order to provide new job opportunities, especially that certain sectors will not recover soon, and those sectors are usually job-rich. Therefore, it's a moment to look broadly and also to look systematically of the social component of any economic recovery. Two positive elements here to take into consideration. One, this recovery can be built around technology, especially we have more than 65% of the population of the Middle East below 30 years. And this is an important asset that the region can use. Greening the recovery is also something that could help reduce risks on water. That is one of the main issues that the region is facing. Allow agriculture to become also a sector that produce not only support to livelihood, but also now with the food security issue, a potential growth in this sector. Also, it's very important for the partners of the region to help. Countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, they have a very strong economic relationship with Europe. And now with the 750 billion package to restore and recover economy in Europe, those are the main trade partners, and with the relocation of activities, they could benefit. The same also could apply by strengthening the economic ties between countries like GCC with Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and others in order to create this new form of regional integration that could allow both to achieve internal development goals on a country-by-country basis, but also to create a greater space for economic and social prosperity. This is an important issue because, as you know, this is something that we have been watching. We have introduced an index back in 2017 that monitors social unrest. And we are still seeing upticks, especially now with countries reopening. We are seeing upticks of some social movements, and it's very important to have this at a key anchor of any recovery strategy.
Thank you, Jihad. We have two more questions on the GCC before moving to other issues. Also from Simeon Kerr, have GCC economic support measures been sufficient to prevent economic damage, especially to the private sector?
Well, Simeon, as you know, GCC countries have introduced three types of packages. One is fiscal package to support livelihood of people. Mostly it was in form of cash transfer, reduction in some bills, deferral of tax payment. This was the first element of their response. The second element of their response was support to a certain number of economic sectors by extending liquidity and financing support through central banks. And in certain cases, like in Bahrain, it went up to higher level. The same thing also in Bahrain, the fiscal package was around 6%. And the third one is by reducing the level of interest rate. On average, it was about 150 basis points, and in certain countries, it went lower than that. What those three packages are telling us that on average, what the GCC have introduced was, I would say, in line with other EMs, maybe less than what we saw in advanced economies. Second point is some countries have already very strong social protection systems, especially to their citizen. For example, in Saudi with the citizen account and also various programs in other countries, which means that they have some type of economic stabilizers that were activated immediately after the shock. Of course, when we look at the GCC, we need to look at some of the key sectors that have been pillar of the diversification. And some of those sectors were affected. For example, tourism, real estate, airline, transportation, logistics. And those would require to maintain for a certain period the level of measures, but making sure that those measures are well targeted and also they are temporary. And this is the name of the game and what is needed today, in parallel with preparing for stronger recovery. What the strong recovery will look like, it's a recovery where gradually we see in the non-oil sector moving up into high value add type of activities where technology will play an important role. We expect to see also some of the sectors that were, I would say, on trial basis, like, for example, greening the recovery in UAE and others, to expand. We expect also that this will give opportunity to streamline some of the public entities and to make them more productive and allow the private sector to gain an additional space in the economy. This also can be done by looking at the support to SMEs, which was one of the issues of the past, and to see how access to finance can be expanded here in this area. Importantly is to make sure that over the medium term, that this process of reducing the dependence on oil and oil cycle will be maintained.
Thank you. The question from Abir Abu Omar, Bloomberg News. The IMF had an estimate that the GCC $2 trillion wealth will dwindle in 2034. Has that estimate changed?
Well, Abir, this was a different, in fact, study. This study was to look in the long term and address some of the structural issues that many commodity-dependent countries, not only in the GCC, are facing. The purpose of this study was to show that the need to gradually start transformation of the economic structure as well as also fiscal management, that in the case of the GCC is happening. We saw several countries diversifying their source of revenues and also recalibrating some of their expenditures. This is something that we also saw during the COVID-19 shock. Some countries have reallocated some of their expenditure items in order to, on one hand, increase the support to the economy, but also do it by reallocating and reprioritizing among the list of expenditures, those who are important. Some also have continued in reforming the subsidy system in order to increase the effectiveness of public spending. Having said that, the second part of your question, which is the size of the assets and how the assets were affected by this crisis, it's a broader question because some of those assets are invested internationally, and therefore only those sovereign wealth funds and those entities in charge of managing these assets can assess a potential impact of what we saw on the markets on the net present value of those assets.
Thank you. Our next question is on debt from oil importers. From Samar Khan, The National. How worried are you about debts of oil importing countries in the MENA region? These countries are forced to accumulate more debts to deal with the economic fallout of COVID-19. Can the current debt levels sustain them through this shock, or they would have to borrow more? And what could the implications be of that?
Well, it's an important question. First, we expect this year to have, unfortunately, an increase in level of debt, especially for oil importing countries. We expect the level of debt on average to reach 95%, which is high and reaching very high levels. Of course, this is something that we are seeing across the globe. Debt is increasing because of the negative growth and the need to provide additional support to livelihood and to the economy. What does it mean? It means that it's very important for countries to, on one hand, to strengthen their fundamentals. And this is where we see differences. Countries who have strong fundamentals were able to sustain the shock, and the impact of this on some of the key financial indicators was milder. The widening of their spreads, for example, the impact on the cost of borrowing was less affected by the crisis than other countries. Therefore, maintaining the cap on improving on a sustainable way the public finance situation is very important. And this needs to be done in different ways, by making sure that investment and spending are productive. And on that, very soon we will publish a study on social spending that will show that both the level of spending and the efficiency of spending needs to be improved. And this has to, for example, in the case of the region, gain more priority. And how to do it? We need to reallocate within the same envelope and reduce or improve spending in other areas. Revenues can be made also more progressive in order to have the right burden sharing and more efficient in terms of revenue administration. Debt and debt management is also an important element. And this is in terms of measures. But there are also important dimensions, which are the medium-term reforms, anchoring fiscal management into medium-term fiscal framework, provide some safeguards to debt and debt development, address structurally those issues, are steps in the right direction. They don't only help in reduce the level of deficit, but also they will reduce the overall risk on the economy. And we all know that this risk will translate into a premium that also the private sector has to pay and the risk of crowding out. Therefore, it's an important pillar, but it's a pillar that has to be done on a country-by-country basis while preserving and protecting what needs to be done to protect lives and to protect livelihoods.
Thank you very much. We have a question on Yemen from Fuad Al-Qadi, YBA News. What is the IMF's role in Yemen, and how can the IMF help improve the banking sector there?
Well, as you know, The fund has been helping Yemen, and Yemen is one of the countries who have benefited from the grant facility that the fund has put explicitly to help countries who cannot borrow during the coronavirus shock. And the fund is in active discussion and dialogue with the authorities, and this is something that we have been doing in order to help strengthen the state institutions, and namely the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. We are helping those two institutions in order to allow those core functions of the state to keep operating and provide the needed support to the overall government as well as also to the economy, avoid the problems that we saw in the past. We are helping them with technical assistance. Also, we're helping them with policy support. And the team is actively working with them, especially to address the recent issues that have been affecting the exchange rate and the overall economic situation. This is one important work that the fund is doing. The other important work that the fund is doing to help a country like Yemen, and this is something, for example, we're doing for Sudan now, is to help mobilize international assistance. We believe that Yemen needs additional assistance, especially in terms of grants. We also are mobilizing international community to keep international presence in terms of medical support, especially to address the coronavirus issues. Also, the support to a livelihood of people, to education, to all these important elements that will allow the minimum of social protection to be maintained and to increase the level of resiliency.
Thank you. Question on Morocco from Youssef Lakhdar from Hespress. حكومة المغرب تتوقع تراجعاً في النمو.
The Moroccan government expects growth to lose 5%. What are your expectations for the situation in Morocco? What about lifting the lockdown? Thank you. Well, before talking about the outlook for this year, we know that the Moroccan economy is one of the most dynamic in the area, and it's also linked to the global value chains. But also, Morocco lately adopted a series of reforms that allowed the country to improve its economic situation, to bring a better macroeconomic stability, and to improve productivity and competitivity, which allowed Morocco to play a bigger economic role. The government also in Morocco adopted rapid measures and important ones. The IMF contributed also, and the private sector was included with all the measures taken by the government to help marginalized categories and poor people. So Morocco is adapting to the new needs in order to face the corona pandemic. The government and the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank also adopted lots of support measures, providing financing to the private sector through credits or improving investments and providing direct support to households in the country. This allowed the country to face the crisis with minimum losses. Now, of course, there are some weaknesses in Morocco and other countries, which is the informal sector. The informal sector is a genuine problem because in this crisis, it gets to lose a lot. And it is very hard to find the tools to reach people working in the informal sector and to provide them with assistance. So authorities in Morocco are trying to work on this problem. Then the agriculture sector is very important in the Moroccan economy. It's also impacted by climate change and, of course, crises such as the COVID-19 crisis. And this as well had an impact on the economy. But again, the measures adopted by the authorities were very helpful, and the IMF supported the government, providing a credit line of $3 billion that was not used during the last 10 years, but is being used during this crisis. And this improved the reserves of the central bank that used very developed monetary and financial tools to control the exchange rates and to improve the confidence of the private sector and of the public sector.
Is Algeria facing a risk of default payment? Is IMF in talks with Algeria about a possible financial support?
Well, Algeria was among the various countries of the region to be affected by the double whammy of the COVID-19 shock, especially with proximity with Europe, and also the shock on the oil price, and as one of the large oil and gas exporter. And this has affected the overall situation in Algeria. But the issue with Algeria that Algeria entered this COVID-19 pandemic with the weak fundamentals, because over the last few years we saw a deterioration in the public finance with increased level of deficit that was monetized to financing from the central bank. And this compounded with the COVID-19 shock and the measures that were needed in order to protect lives, and also the decline in oil price has weakened further the macroeconomic stability of Algeria. We are, of course, with Algeria in active discussions and dialogue. I visited Algeria back in February, a few months ago, and had the opportunity to meet the president, the prime minister, and the economic team. I think what the economic team is looking forward in terms of reforms need to be activated and strengthened in order to, on one hand, keep providing support to protect population from the outbreak and potential second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also gradually to improve the fundamentals of the economy and allow Algeria to protect its level of foreign reserves, and also to maintain its capacity to reallocate resources internally in order to provide additional social support to its population.
Thank you. We have two more questions. One question is in Arabic from Saad Zayatni, صحيفة الشرق الأوسط.
After lifting the lockdown in many countries, there is a rather quick recovery. Do you believe this will have an impact on the growth in the Gulf country and the Middle East countries as a whole? What do you expect? Well, it's an important question. In the Middle East or worldwide, we are facing problems to have accurate expectations because the situation, of course, is unclear. At this point, we do not know if we are to expect a rebound or a second wave of the virus. We do not know how strong the recovery will be. When it comes for the Middle East, we do not know what will happen to oil prices. Will they recover strongly or not? And as I said in the beginning of the presser, the countries in the area were able to adopt very important measures to protect their citizens and to contain the spread of the virus and to provide a social safety nets. So this is an important point. Of course, there are differences between countries when it comes to the public health sectors and so on and capabilities. But what we should concentrate on now are 3 points. First, we need to continue protecting the health of the citizens and to provide a social protection. This means to increase readiness and investment in the health sector and in the social and health infrastructures. This applies mostly to the poorest country in the area. Second, we need to concentrate on the economic recovery in 2 parts. First, we need financial stability. So we need to be very cautious in managing public spending. And then we have to push the recovery forward by using our strengths, for instance, technology, because we have a young society, educated one, that can use technology in a very efficient way. And this can be very helpful in bringing jobs and stability. A protective society needs also better investment in the economic infrastructure, and the government plays here the role of the party presenting incentives, and the private sector plays the most important role in encouraging productivity. Women need to play a very important role at this level, especially with its education, and this is a very important point that would support growth. And finally, what is very important as well, we need to improve the economic productivity by increasing cooperation. We do know that we have lots of capitals coming from remittances from workers in the Gulf countries, for many Arab countries. We have the SMEs with a huge potential to improve the economic recovery. So we are in transition phase, a very difficult one. The main point I want to concentrate on is that we need to move forward as quickly as possible in decision making. We need to act ahead of time and not wait. We have to be creative in adapting policies, because this is one of the worst crises the area have seen in the last 100 years.
Question from Hajar Omran, Forbes Middle East. How many Arab countries asked for financial support? Will the IMF consider additional financial support for Arab countries?
Well, the region has benefited by more than $17 billion, which is one of the highest increase in providing fund facilities by the IMF in 1 year. Most of those funds went to Arab countries like Egypt, $8 billion, Morocco, $3 billion, Tunisia, $750, Jordan, 400 RFI plus $1.2 billion for an IFF. Mauritania, Djibouti, also I mentioned Yemen, Somalia, with whom we had a very positive development this year, with an important debt reprofiling that helped Somalia get additional assistance and debt forgiveness and allow Somalia to strengthen the recovery. Currently, we're working in supporting Sudan too. Our work in the region has been scaled up, and not only financially, and I think this is an important element to mention. We have provided a lot of policy support. We have been actively engaging with our counterparts, the regional institutions, Arab Monetary Fund, Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development, Islamic Development Bank, and other institutions to, in fact, provide joint support to the region. We have provided proactive technical assistance and policy advice to many of the governments of the region. And with the Saudi G20 presidency, the fund has been actively working with Saudi presidency to develop an important global facility that hopefully will help as many developing countries, some countries from the region, to benefit from debt reprofiling and reduce the burden of debt servicing for this year and next year. Those are among some of the activities that we have in the region. We are committed to help. And to answer the second part of the questions, we are also actively discussing with some other countries. Thanos mentioned Lebanon, a country that is dear to my heart, but as Lebanese national, I cannot speak in details about it. But Thanos mentioned that we are in active discussion with the authorities. We are also in discussions with others like Iraq, with whom we have had several exchanges. Tunisia, authorities are signaling that they would like to have access to a fund facility, and so on and so forth. I think what is important is we believe that our role currently is to help the global economy and the region too address one of the most challenging crisis like no other, and we will put all our efforts behind that. But when we do this, also we need to make sure that we are helping countries to be sustainable. And sometimes it's very important also to keep an eye on how the fundamental issues in macroeconomic management are run. The debt and the debt sustainability is an important aspect. The good allocation of resources in order to allocate them where priorities are and to favor now social protection. Make sure that economies are active and productive and allow those economies to create the level of growth that is needed for their youth to find the jobs that they deserve and for this economy to benefit from huge potential that it has, which is its human capital.
Thank you very much, Jihad. With this, we will conclude the press briefing on the Middle East and Central Asia Regional Economic Outlook. Thank you, Thanos, and thank you all for joining us. The recorded video of the press briefing can be found on the IMF website later today. Thank you.